Here's the agenda for the next 45 minutes. We'll try and get it through quickly so we'll have time for question and answer at the end. Start with what is H.264. H.264 is important because that's the primary codec you're going to use to send video to iDevices. There's two primary use cases for producing for iDevices. One is tethered delivery via iTunes. The other is transmitting to connected devices either via Wi-Fi or cellular, either using Hdtv live streaming, which is the primary case, or just single file streaming. Okay? Who here is going to be producing files for iTunes? Okay. So we're going to cover H.264 quickly, what you need to know, what you need to care about, and then we'll get into configuring your video. H.264, the thing that you need to know, it's a wonderful standard. It's adapted by the ITU, the ISO, but if you're here for iDevices, it's the primary codec to use for iDevices, and that's really all you need to know. When you're producing for iDevices, the critical characteristic you need to know is something called a profile. So what is an H.264 profile? As you can see in the chart, it defines a set of coding tools or algorithms that can be used to generate the bit stream. So the coding tools on the left, we see IMP slices, B slices, multiple reference frames. Those are the compression techniques. And on the right, we see the baseline profile, we see the main profile, and the high profile, which are the three that we typically care about. Very few applications allow you to use the extended profile, and it really has no application in the iDevice space. So looking at this, you see that the baseline profile has the fewest compression techniques applied to it. There's only 4 yeses, and the rest are nos. High profile has the most yeses, has the most compression techniques available for that profile. So looking at that, you'd probably guess, okay, the baseline profile gives us lower quality because there are less complex compression algorithms used, but it's probably an easier to playback stream for precisely that reason. So the baseline profile gives you the lowest possible quality, but it's easy to play back, and the high profile gives you the highest possible quality, and it's a little bit harder to play back. Why did the H.264 creators give us profiles? So that people who were producing devices could support H.264 at a more or less limited level. So when Apple decided to build the original iPod, they wanted to support H.264, but they needed to limit the budget for RAM and for CPU power. So they said, okay, we'll support the baseline profile. And you as a video producer, if you want to get your video on that device, you know that you need to produce to H.264 using the baseline profile in your encoding tool. So it's a convenient meeting spot between hardware developers on one side and video producers on the other side. So it's critical to know the target profile before you start encoding. And we're going to look into this in a lot more detail in a few moments, but at a high level, the iPod, iPhone through 4G uses the baseline profile. And the iPad at the high end is going to be using the main profile. And as I said, we'll cover that in more detail in a few moments. Issues to consider, what happens if you're producing one file that you want to play on all connected devices, then you need to use the baseline profile, but you're also going to have to limit the resolution and the data rate of your video, so it's going to look pretty ugly on an iPad. And we'll talk about strategies for supporting multiple devices with multiple files in a minute. If you want to produce a file that you want to play on computers and iDevices, typically, if you're looking at the iPad class of devices, you'll use the main profile. So basically what you need to do is you need to figure out which devices you want to support, and then you make sure that you use the baseline or use the profile that plays on the lowest common denominator device. What are H.264 levels? Profiles talks about encoding techniques. Levels talks about parameters like data rate and resolution. So whenever you're producing for iDevices, the thing you need to know is, what's the profile that it supports, what level does it support? And we'll show a chart that has all that information in a few moments. The thing about encoding for iDevices is, the required parameters vary by device. It's a very technical encode. If you produce using the wrong profile, your file won't load on your target device. All of us who've used with iTunes have seen that. So if you're just starting out with the iDevices, you need to find an encoding tool that you trust and then use their templates pretty much unadjusted to make sure the device the device can play the video file that you create. So that's pretty much all you need to know about H.264 to produce for iDevices. We're going to look at two scenarios. One is video podcasts, and one is streaming to iDevices that are connected via either Wi-Fi or cellular. So this is the chart I keep referring to. It's a beast. Obviously it's available on the PDF for your download, so don't worry if you can't see it here. And basically what you can see is there are four classes of iDevices. This is the original iDevice, and it can play video, baseline profile up to level 1.3. And what that meant was, 320 by 240 video with a maximum data rate of 768 kilobits per second. So 320, 240 is a relatively small stream, right? It's going to look fine on a tiny iPod, but it's going to look pretty ugly on an iPad. So this is the oldest class of video-capable iPod devices. The next class was, the Ipod Touch and the original iPhone, the iPod Nano and Classic. They support video encoded using the baseline profile up to level 3.0. That means 640 by 480 resolution with a maximum video data rate of 2.5 megabits per second. So this is the class that most people tend to support. Okay, we'll look at some detailed results from a survey that I produced, and this is where most people start. They want to produce a file that plays here, and if you produce a high-quality 640, 480 file, it will not only play here and look good, it will also look pretty decent on iPhone 4, iPod Touch 4, and the iPad 1 class of devices, even though they can play 720p video, which uses the main profile, up to level 3.1. The iPhone 4S and the iPad 2, technically, they support the high profile to level 1 up to 1080p resolution. But they only support this if you're playing it to a connected device via some kind of connected cable on the iPad 2 or the iPhone 4S. We'll look at the spec sheet in a second. If you're producing for playback on these devices, you want to use 720p as a maximum. You don't want to use 1080p to play it back on these devices. And let me show you what I mean. So this is the spec sheet for the iPad 2, and what it says is it supports up to 1080p with the digital video AV connector or the Apple VGA adapter. Okay, so it can play 1080p, but only out through this port. Can't play it natively on the device. So if you're producing for playback on the iPad itself and viewing on the iPad, you shouldn't use 1080p. Now there's one thing about this chart that's kind of striking, is that the maximum audio data rate is 160 kilobits per second all the way across. Now we're going to look at a chart in about 5 minutes that shows that music videos that are produced by popular music artists are all encoded at 256 kilobits per second. Technically, they're over the specifications that Apple produces for these devices. And again, this is the iPad 2 spec. There's two codecs supported here. One is there's multiple. There's H.264 video codec up to 1080p. That's what we saw on the chart. And AAC LC audio up to 160 kilobits per second. Again, what we saw on the chart. So we've got this disconnect between what people are doing and what's actually working and what Apple's putting in their spec sheets. So, I'm going to probably tell you to do what's working and just make sure that you test. The other point is if you use the MPEG-4 codec, which is a much lower quality version of the H.264 codec, you can use up to 160 kilobits per second of audio per channel. So maybe there's an error in the spec sheet. I don't know, they've been this way forever, so it doesn't seem like it is. But nobody is using the MPEG-4 video codec in the music videos they're producing. They're all using H.264, and they're all producing at 256 kilobits per second. This isn't the only time there was a disconnect between what people are producing and what's actually working and what the Apple specs are. So, you know, if it's working, you know, that's what I would do, but it always scares me to recommend 256 kilobits audio when the devices themselves are only spec'd out at 160 kilobits per second. So if you're looking at this chart, and these are all video capable iDevices, right? I mean, some are tethered only. So the iPod Nano and the iPod Classic, you can only support with iTunes. The original iPod, the same thing. iPod, iPhone, pretty much everything to the right you can get to either Wi-Fi or cellular. So the question is, you know, do I want to support the original iPod? Should I produce a 320 by 240 stream? You know, that's a question that you have to really think about. And then it's, you know, do I create one file in the 640, 480 range that supports everything to the right and just forget about the green ones, which is what a lot of producers are doing, or do I produce multiple files? And that's what some producers are doing. We'll look at examples of that in a second. And the final question we're going to address is, should I produce 1080p for the iPhone 4S and iPad 2? And you know, there the answer is no, because the files don't play natively on those files. They only play with the adapters. So let's go through those questions one by one, and I'll show you the survey results.
Quick question.
Yes?
What would the typical data rate be for, let's say, 720p?
We'll get to it. OK, so what I did last week was I downloaded about 100 and some files from iTunes. Most of them were free, but I also downloaded, I guess, 6 or 7 music videos and then 10 or 12 HD television programs. Because I wanted to see what are typical producers doing from a data rate perspective, what are they doing from a resolution perspective. And that's kind of what I'm going to show. The questions we're going to answer are the ones that I raised. And so here's the survey, 98 files. These are the free files that I downloaded. 3-letter networks, you know, ABC, CBS, CNN, Prominent Technology and other sites, CNET, Revision 3, This Week in Tech, you know, the featured podcasts on iTunes, the one that, you know, Apple was promoting. So question 1, should you abandon 320 by 240? What I did is I looked to see, you know, I looked for the smallest, lowest quality file I could. Anytime there was an HD option, I looked to see if there was an SD option. I only found 5 of 98 files that were 320 by 240 or lower. A year and a half ago, I did this survey, and I think 30% of the sites supported the first generation iPods. This time I looked a year and a half later, and it's down to maybe 6%. 2 of those sites were Revision 3 and CNET, who they had 2 shows each that supported 320, 240. The only other company that supported that size was Merrill Lynch. And then once I saw these results, I deliberately looked at sites that you would think would have the broadest possible coverage, like US government sites, CNN, the AARP, some of the 3-letter networks. And all of those produced a targets larger than 320 by 240. So if I'm producing a podcast, unless I absolutely know that I've got target customers with these old devices, I just don't produce a 320 by 240 any longer. So question 2, should you support should you support everything to the right of those earliest devices with a single stream? 50 of the 98 podcasts were either 640 by 480 or 640 by 360. So what they decided was to support that one clump of streams and then everything to the right of that with a single file. My conclusion is that unless you have a compelling reason to produce at 720p, and we'll look at that in a second, for most producers, a single 640, 480 or 640 by 360 file should be fine. should you distribute multiple files? You know, there were two scenarios where companies seemed to distribute multiple files. One were tech sites. You know, all three tech sites distributed multiple files. You know, CNET and revision 3 went to 720p and down to 320 by 240. You know, so tech sites do it because I think they know that they want to reach the broadest possible audience. That doesn't seem to be a general use case. The other use case was really compelling HD content, premium content. You know, some of the NASA space videos were produced at 720p, and screen cam videos. So if I'm producing a screen cam training video, they look much better at 720p than they do at 640, 360, because you really have to scale them down to make them fit in that window. So if you're producing informational news type videos, it's not entertainment, it's just informational, I don't see going to 720p. 7 of 16 producers who did offer a 720p stream also offered a lower resolution stream. So if you are going to go to 720p, you should strongly consider another option that plays on older iDevices. Should you encode for 1080p for iPhone 4S and iPad 2? Only for playback with external adapters. And I think that's a pretty limited use case, not something you'd want to distribute via iTunes. What do music videos look like? So these are 6 music videos that I downloaded. All were close to 640 by 480 or smaller. The average data rate was 1.5 megabits per second. Frame rate, 23.976. All were filmed in the whole make it look like movies mode. And pretty much every one targeted 256 kilobits per second. So even though that audio is more than what any of these devices are spec'd out as playing, this is what the producers used when they produced those files. And then they all used stereo, that's 2 channels, and the average bits per pixel is 0.260. These are pretty high quality files. As you would expect. People are paying for them, they want to produce high quality video, high quality audio, and that's why they use those parameters. What about Hdtv? A couple of interesting things here. These were all produced to display at 720p. So even though the width of the file was 960, when the file was played, it was zoomed out to a full 1280, by messing with the aspect ratio during compression. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second with the SD files that I'm going to talk about. But that's something you can do with some encoding tools, but it's not something you can do with all encoding tools. I know you can do it with compressor. I don't think you can do it with squeeze. I don't think you can do it with episode. The average data rate was around 4 megabits per second. Your comment about 14 megabits per second, I think that is way too high. And we're seeing, these are HD episodes that people download, and we're seeing an average data rate of 4 megabits per second. So we're going to look at what the survey results were. They were in the 3 megabits per second range. Premium content people are paying is 4 megabits per second. So I would never encode at an average data rate higher than that because I think it's just you're wasting disk space on the people's iPods, and if there's any bandwidth charges, you're wasting money there. Everybody used the native frame rate, either 23, 29, or 25 frames per second. The audio was pretty high, but not excessively high. So everybody was stereo. Typical target was around 160 kilobits per second. And the bits per pixel was around 0.195. Hdtv episodes. It's interesting that if you buy an HD file on iTunes, you download both an HD file and an SD file. And I think Apple does that because everybody wants HD, but they don't know if their devices support HD or not. So if I'm on my old first generation iPhone, it's like, yeah, I want an HD file. So I download that, and if I didn't download an SD file, it wouldn't play. And what Apple does is they download them both. They load the one that will load, and the user doesn't even know that there's multiple files unless they check their hard drive. It's actually pretty slick. User doesn't need to know what, the chart that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. They just get something that plays on their iDevice. Now, all these are 640 by 480 resolution files, which sounds like 4:3 aspect ratio. But as we're going to see in a second, the people who produce these files are using aspect ratio adjustments to display them at 853 by 480. Average data rate, again, 1.5 megabits per second. Pretty much the same thing as we saw in our music videos. Frame rate, native. Audio data rate, 128 as opposed to 160, all stereo. Average bits per pixel was about 0.177. So and this is important and interesting. So it's a nice, kind of a fun. So here's Californication. Love David Duchovny. So here, if I look at the file in Media Info is a file analysis tool, and this is going to tell me the resolution of the file. So if I look here, I see the file resolution is 640 by 480. Now, why is the file resolution important? The file resolution is important because if it's bigger than 640 by 480, oh, that didn't work. If it's bigger than 640 by 480, it's not going to play on this class of device, right? Because this class of device has a maximum resolution of 640 by 480. So if you look at the file and you analyze it in Media Info, as I just did, you see the resolution is 640 by 480. If you actually play the file in QuickTime, QuickTime stretches the file, and we have an 853 by 480 presentation. Okay? So what they're doing is they're encoding the file at a resolution of 640 by 480, but they're telling the player to scale it out by a factor of 1.33 during decode. So they're producing an 853 by 480 experience from a 640 by 480 file. Now, I don't know if the reason they do that in this case is because that's the only way to get it to play on those older generation iDevices. I don't know why they're doing it for the 720p files. I don't think there's any advantage to doing that. A 960 by 720 file as opposed to 1280 by 720. But as long as the numbers are kind of the numbers, that's what they're doing. And I wanted to show you how it worked. So again, this is Media Info, which is a free file analysis tool. That's seeing 640 by 480 pixels. That's what iTunes sees when they try and load the file onto your iPod. And when QuickTime plays the file, it scales it out to 853 by 640. And that's why all these resolutions are 640 by 480, but we're still looking at a 16 by 9 file during playback. It's pretty slick.
Is that distorting the image?
No, because they're accounting for it in they're planning for it during the encoding, right? So it's kind of like how TV works. If you shoot TV widescreen, you capture 720 by 480 pixels, but the aspect ratio is 1.2. So the pixels are during display, the pixels are zoomed out, so you end up with a 16 by 9 display. That's how it works. The native file is 720 by 480, but during display, the aspect ratio that's ingrained in the file tells the player to push it out lengthwise. So, because they accounted for that during encoding, it doesn't distort. And you can see the file here, she just doesn't look distorted. This is what she looks like. And if you go to Duchovny, who you may be more familiar with, there's a couple of scenes in here where he's being interviewed. you know, that's what he looks like. He's not being squeezed or stretched, or that's just him. Okay, so those were the results. You know, if I'm looking at doing music videos or TV shows, these are the screens that I want to reference, right? Because this is what everybody else is doing. What should we do, you know, for not Hollywood producers or music video producers? What should we do when we're producing our own files for iTunes? What I did was I looked at the survey results for this class. So this class is the 320 by 240 class. The device maximum is 768 kilobits per second. The average in the files produced in this class were around 528 kilobits per second. So I would go to my encoding tool and make sure that the encoding parameters matched this value, were around 5 to 520 kilobits per second, and didn't exceed the 768 kilobits per second, which I presume they wouldn't. At 640 by 360 or 640 by 480, the average in the survey was 1.16 megabits per second. So it's about 25 to 30% lower than what we saw for music videos and what we saw for SD television shows. And the maximum in this class is 2.5 megabits per second. Audio was 98 kilobits. Device maximum, actually this should be 160, excuse me. So I would make sure that my template at this resolution targeted around 1.2 megabits per second and didn't exceed 2.5 megabits per second. And this is another, mismatch between what the specs say and what video producers are doing. If you look at the specs for the iPad 1, it says it only plays main profile. 9 of the 16 files that I downloaded were high profile, and they played fine both on the iPad 1 and 2 and also on the iPod Touch 4G. So this is another disconnect between what Apple tells you it plays and what actual producers are doing. What do? I mean, I recommend using the main profile just because I don't like violating a published spec. But clearly, you know, a lot of producers are going to the high profile to get that extra bit of quality. The average data rate in this class of videos, you know, we saw the HD programs in the 4 megabit per second range. In the free category, these videos were produced at around 3 megabits per second. The device maximum is 14 megabits per second. If you look at the Apple compressor preset for 720p, the target data rate is 10 megabits per second, and the maximum is obviously 14. So that's much more data than you need to get good quality at this resolution. And then for the free podcast, the average data rate was around 111 kilobits per second stereo. The device maximum is 160. Okay, so that's the iTunes podcast side of the story. And now we're going to get to the adaptive streaming, the connected delivery. So now we're connecting to our iDevices via Wi-Fi or cellular. And we're going to introduce you to adaptive streaming, talk about Hdtv live streaming, and then talk a little bit about what's called transmuxing, which is the ability to take one stream and then target it towards different targets. Very few publishers want iDevices alone. Everybody wants a desktop player, whether it's Flash or Silverlight, and iDevices. And there's a very efficient way to do that via technologies that transmux. And we'll cover that at the very end. So the concept of adaptive streaming is to customize the experience for the viewer, device, and bandwidth. That means you produce multiple files, and some at lower data rates, some at high data rates. And when the connection speed is adequate and the CPU horsepower on the playback side is adequate, you send the higher quality file. When the connection speed is lower and CPU power is lower, you send a low quality file. It's all transparent to the viewer, and it's all adaptive. So if something happens to the viewer's bandwidth, the stream will change, all behind the scenes. Two issues there. How many streams do you produce? What resolutions? What data rates? Apple provides a really good starting point for that. We'll look at it in a moment. Once you decide how many streams you're going to produce and what resolutions and data rates, It's, how do you adjust the encoding parameters that you use to account for the fact that you're distributing adaptively as opposed to using a single file. So this is our introduction to HTTP live streaming. It's available for iOS devices, and it's also supported by Android 3.0 devices. So what do you need to learn from this chart? Here's kind of the workflow for HTTP live streaming. And we start with our video input. We convert it into an H.264 file. So H.264 is the only codec supported for HTTP live streaming, also called HLS. We chunk the stream up. We divide the stream into usually 8 or 10-second chunks. Those are the chunks of data that are encoded using the MPEG-2 transport stream. And then we create an index file or a manifest file that contains the locations of the alternate streams and the locations of the chunks in the alternate streams. So this is what a manifest file structure might look like for a 3-stream adaptive streaming experience. Now, what happens here is the player is in charge of monitoring the buffer condition on the player side. There's no CPU checking for HTTP live streaming. So assuming this file was sent, the first chunk of the low-quality stream was sent first. The player checks the buffer and says, well, buffer's good. Why don't we try and improve the experience here by jumping to a higher quality stream? So the player says, time to switch streams. I'm going to go to the index file. Oops, here's the mid-quality file. And here's the location of the next chunk for me to retrieve. If things go well, you may decide for chunk 3 to go to the high-quality file and just get chunk 3 of that. But the player, it's a serverless solution. The player is in charge of monitoring the buffer, and the player is in charge of retrieving the chunks as necessary to change streams. And that's how HLS works. There's 2 files created. One is the series of chunks, and one are the index files that tell the player where to get the next chunks of data. Now, in terms of number of streams and their configuration, this is what Apple recommends. So if you go to the URL cited here, you'll get to a page that gives you number of streams and suggested configurations for 16:9 aspect ratio and also 4:3 aspect ratio. So this should be the starting point for anybody who's producing for iDevices. A couple points here I want to make. Looks like the keyframe interval is changing here. So here we have a keyframe interval of 30. Here we have a keyframe interval of 45. Here we have a keyframe interval of 90. The keyframe interval is not changing because you're using a different data rate for each keyframe setting. So here you're using, I'm sorry, I said data rate, I meant frame rate. So here we're using a frame rate of 10. So this is a keyframe interval of 3 seconds. Here we're using a frame rate of 15. So it's also a keyframe interval of 3 seconds. And here we're using a keyframe interval of 90 at full frame rate, 30 frames per second. That's also a keyframe interval of 3 seconds. And I'm making this point because one of the key encoding requirements when producing for adaptive streaming is to produce files with the same keyframe interval, because you can only switch streams on a keyframe interval, so you need to do that. Another point here, how much audio is Apple recommending that you encode? Here's 150 kilobits per second total. Here's 110 video. What's the difference? 40 kilobits per second. Down here at the high end, we've got a 4.54 total bit rate and a video bit rate of 4.5. What's the audio? 40 kilobits per second. So Apple is basically saying use a consistent audio stream in all the adaptive alternatives. And they're also saying change the profile to use a higher quality profile for those devices that can play it. Okay? And the manifest file structure is smart enough so that devices that can only play the baseline profile won't try and retrieve a stream that's encoded with the main profile. Okay? So now we know the stream count, resolution, and data rate. How do we customize for adaptive? Again, keyframe interval is key. And there's two concepts here. One's the concept of the keyframe. One is the concept of the chunk size. The keyframe interval should divide evenly into the chunk size. Why? Because you want the first frame in every chunk to be a keyframe. And if it's a 9-second chunk, use a keyframe interval of 3 or 1 or 9. The other concept is the keyframe location must be identical in all streams. So use the same keyframe interval. We talked about that. And disable scene change detection. Right? So scene change detection gives the encoding tool the ability to insert a keyframe if there's a scene change. You typically want to disable that when you're encoding for adaptive streaming. You want regular keyframes because that works best within the stream switching structure. Okay, VBR, CBR. VBR is variable bitrate encoding. CBR is constant bitrate encoding. CBR is the more conservative approach because it produces the smoothest stream, which is the easiest to deliver consistently, but the quality can suffer. So this is the same file. On the left, this file was encoded using constant bitrate encoding. You see very little variation in the average data rate. But this particular file, which is right after a cut between two cameras, is pretty awful. It's a very high motion sequence because it's right after a dissolve. And looks awful here, looks great here, because this is variable bitrate encoding. And it can raise the data rate for those series of frames to give you better quality. Okay, so that's the tension. You like constant bitrate because you get a consistent stream. You like variable bitrate because you get better overall quality. And here's what can happen if you have a VBR stream in an adaptive streaming scenario. 3 chunks here. This is an average size. This is a large chunk because there's high motion video here. Here's a low motion chunk, smaller. When this chunk goes out, the buffer stays good, right? The data is delivered in the normal amount of time because it's a normal sized chunk. But here's the big chunk, high motion, spike in the data rate because VBR wanted to produce higher quality. This chunk takes longer to deliver. During that period of time, the buffer level drops, and the player says, I'm in trouble, I need to change to a lower quality stream. So what we have here is a stream switch that's triggered not by a change in conditions, but by how we encoded our videos. And you want to avoid too many stream switches because that degrades the experience. Okay? So the most conservative approach is to use CBR. Most of the consulting work that I've done, I've recommended CPR because people are just starting out. Be aware that a lot of the producers, like MTV, are using VBR. They're using constrained VBR. They're not exceeding 200% of the file bandwidth, but they are using VBR because they want that extra quality. Again, if what I recommend is CBR until you get it working. Maybe introduce VBR down the road, but CBR is the most conservative approach. Audio parameters, same thing. Apple says use the same audio parameters because that eliminates issues relating to audible artifacts between stream switches. You can hear it when it switches because it's changing to a different audio parameter. The problem with that, if you're MTV, is that if somebody's got a 3.5 megabyte stream, you want them to have 128 kilobits of audio because the audio is valuable. And you can't have 128 kilobits of audio at the lower level because it's just too much, the stream will never get there. So again, the most conservative approach, if it's a CEO talking or a training session, audio isn't a significant component of it, I would go out at 40 or 64 kilobits mono in all streams. If it's a premium entertainment experience, audio quality matters, I would probably jump to a higher audio bit rate at the higher quality streams, understanding that it may cause a slight pop when you switch the streams. Something you need to listen for, and you need to make the trade-off yourself, but I just wanted you to be aware of it. And then in terms of other H.264 encoding parameters, what we saw Apple tell us is that you need to change the profile that you're using when you're encoding to customize it to give the highest possible quality for all devices you're serving. Baseline profile to older devices that can't play anything else, but you want to switch to the main profile for newer devices because that gives you better quality. Okay, a few minutes on transmuxing technologies. Again, most producers want to stream both to iDevices and to a desktop client. In the past, you needed two separate encoding banks, one for Flash or Silverlight and one for iDevices. What transmuxing technologies do is allow you to input one stream, and then the server will dynamically create other streams as necessary to support other devices. Now, they're not re-encoding. They're not re-encoding the streams. They're just changing the file header and creating the manifest files. So in this scenario, if I send a Flash file in, it's still H.264. And what the Wowza Media Server will do is it will change the header from RTMP type header to the MPEG-2 transport stream header, and it will create the manifest files in real time. So you send one stream in, and then you can direct that stream to two different clients because the transmuxing is being done by the server. Technology providers include Wowza, Microsoft, and Adobe. The Adobe Flash Media Server 4.5 has the ability to transmux an incoming Flash stream and send it off to iDevices. That's relatively new in the last 3 or 4 months. And then some of the service, I guess, Real Networks Helix server can also do that. And then Akamai in their system has what they call in the network repackaging. So they can do that in their own system. If you use Akamai, you can send them one stream, and they'll do the transmuxing in the system. The high-level point you should walk away with is you don't have to create two separate files, two separate encoding experiences to serve two different clients. You should be able to find a solution where you transmux. This is very popular now, and most live streaming service providers and most OVPs can provide this type of functionality. And if you're going to be doing this stuff yourself or just want to check up on the consultants you're using, these are some of the sources that that I refer to when I'm doing production work. Apple does a nice job documenting, as you saw with that one screen that shows all the data rates and resolutions. Okay, so if you're serving two connected iDevices, HLS, HTTP live streaming is the preferred approach, gives you the best experience, dynamic, adaptive, all that good stuff. If you're not using adaptive, you can't really offer a really high quality stream because only viewers on fast connections can view it. Some people will view a stream that will stop and start. That's never good. You can offer a lowest common denominator stream. That might look good on a 320 by 240 display, but wouldn't look good on an iPad. Or you can let the viewer select, which is not what most people are doing. So these are pretty much suggestions. If you decide to do a high quality stream and you don't care if people can't retrieve it on lower speed devices, this might be a good approach. If you want a low quality stream that should play everywhere but won't look good on an iPad, this is what I would do. And if you wanted a mid-level approach that will play on most devices, won't look terrible on an iPad, these are the parameters I would use here. These are pretty much numbers out of the air almost. I mean, if your HLS is the preferred approach, if you're encoding a file, that kind of gives you some leeway in terms of approaches you might take. Again, a high quality experience on the left may not play everywhere smoothly. Low quality experience on the right will play smoothly everywhere but won't look that good. And then kind of a middle ground. Most of the information in this presentation you can read as well as I can. The book is available on Amazon. And we have time probably for a question or two till they start knocking down the doors, if anybody has any.
As far as we're trying to do DVR controls and duration in the M3 rate, how does that work? Does the duration change as the video progresses? It's a live event and we're streaming it, and I'm the UI developer. I'm trying to get access to the right duration and the right current time of the video element. So it seems like there's different implementations, and Akamai doesn't know the answer yet.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer either.
Okay.
I mean, I know that the manifest file dynamically updates.
Dynamically update, I would assume that maybe as the event continues, because it works the same whether I'm using my controls or the Apple native controllers. It starts off at some duration, and then eventually it kicks in. But it's,
I'm sorry, that's
okay, no
a
problem.
bit more technical than where I live.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, just my question is surrounding quality and frequency of keyframes. So we're actually using a Brightcove as kind of a video platform, and so we do have a lot of this kind of encoding capability in-house. So we're really focusing on creating the best mezzanine level file to then upload it. And I do have a lot of control on Brightcove over setting them, and your folks have been actually really helpful in customizing. But a lot of it's shorter content, so I want the quality to switch more frequently. So I'm setting shorter keyframes, like a 1 second keyframe. Does that degrade quality to have more frequent keyframes? And does the frequency of the keyframe in the mezzanine matter for the encodes and the renditions?
Okay, so I'm repeating the questions for the millions of people who watch this. So does frequency of keyframes degrade quality? Yes. Keyframes are the least efficient frames of the 3 frame types. How significant is it? In the mezzanine file, you can have an unlimited data rate. I mean, I wouldn't even mess with it there because you're not, really it happens more when you're producing for the ultimate file. That's where I would worry about it. So it doesn't, if you're producing at 20 megabits per second, a 720p file, keyframe isn't going to matter because it's, all the frames are so big and it's such a high quality file. But you are correct, but if you're doing it for iDevices in terms of the ability for the technology to switch streams nimbly, you do want more frequent keyframes, but chunk size in the HLS world is a more important concept. Because even if you had 9 keyframes in a 9-second chunk, it can't change until that chunk's over, right? So you'd want to change the chunk size rather than the keyframe interval. And after, Squeeze 8 actually has 2 sets of presets, one for long form content where you want longer chunks, longer keyframe intervals because you care more about file efficiency over long term, and one with shorter chunks and shorter keyframes. So they're kind of endorsing your technique, but I think you need to be worried. With Hdtv-based technologies like HLS, you can only change streams at a chunk. You can't change streams within a keyframe. So that's the one that gives you agility.
And are you recommending actually doing CBR rather than DVR at that level for the HLS so that it's a smoother transition?
So what do I recommend for, it's very hard because, when I'm coming in as a consultant, I want it to work. Right. So I recommend CBR because I know that's the most conservative approach. And then if I go to VBR, I make it very tightly constrained VBR. So it might be constrained to 1.25, or 125% of data rate because I want it to work. Right. But MTV, who does a lot of adaptive streaming, they use 200% constrained VBR in some of their streams. So I know what they're doing, but I just, I want it to work for my client. And then I tell them, once you get it rolled out, once you get it proven, if you want to experiment with VBR down the road, then you can try it. But I think it's more important at first to just get it working and get it working smoothly. Anything else?
How available is the logic for the adaptive switching?
Say it again?
Like the logic that goes into the adaptive switching of renditions?
It's not. How available is the logic? I think it's a total black box. I think as it relates to the iDevice anyway. I don't know how much there is in Flash, but I think iDevice is a pretty black box. They have mentioned that where most players like Smooth Streaming Client and the Flash Client will look at both CPU and buffer, HLS Client only looks at buffer. And that could be because they're so tightly specced that if it's going to play a baseline stream, they know there's not going to be a CPU issue, right? Whereas with the Flash player, if you send too big a file, it's not going to play smoothly. So as far as I know, you don't have any input into that. We good?
Great.
Thanks for your attention.